here's the big picture as I understand it. And again, I definitely encourage people to go look at the Boer Republic interview with Millennial Woes. Those guys are great. Jason and I spoke to them when we were on Tutar in October. But essentially, you get a good overview. And this is what I picked up from them. And please, Jason or Mike, fill me in if you have anything to add to this. But essentially, they had this whole Rainbow Nation concept. It turned out to be, as we see over the last couple of decades, a failed experiment. Now, South Africa had been built up by the Dutch, English, and some other populations, German and Slavic, Scottish, I believe, too, Boer Republic was saying, but a bunch of different white Western populations there had built it up, the infrastructure, the farming, into essentially a first world nation right down there on the tip of the African continent. When the first settlers arrived there in the early 1600s, they went to areas where there were no tribes. And yes, there were eventually conflicts when they came across these peoples, but for the most part, they began the farmlands and they began cultivating that land where there weren't any tribes. The tribes came later. Because of all the innovation, because of all the infrastructure over the centuries, you had, as I said, a first world nation at its peak a couple of decades ago. And then in 1994, they kind of gave it away with the Nelson Mandela era coming in. Even so, I remember following a little bit of the 2010 World Cup, and it was probably the only sub-Saharan nation that had the infrastructure to support something like hosting the soccer World Cup. Even though, as I was following that story a little bit at the time, it was a little hairy. You know, they were almost missing some deadlines, and it was not quite as smooth as hosting the World Cup in a first world population, a first world country, but they did pull it off. But essentially, over the course of the 20th century, the African population there in South Africa grew 800%. Okay, so that doesn't sound exactly like a people who are being oppressed or on the wane the way that we are. Look at what Mike just said about the declining Australian white population. We have the same thing going on here in the United States. The basic thing is the whites will innovate. They will build the infrastructure. They had their own distinct places. You had a multi-ethnic state. So they had a certain amount of separation. And this was presented, again, in the media, in the narrative, as apartheid as this evil thing. And even without the world trading with South Africa for some of the past decades in the late 20th century, there was still an amazing amount of innovations, even though they were cut off from trade because the evils of apartheid. It might be easy for self-professed liberals and progressives to look on apartheid South Africa and say, oh my God, it's like modern day segregation. How backwards can you be? But this was their way. You have to hear it from their own mouth, their way of dealing with the fact that they had separate populations that had separate ways of life, and they had their discrete areas. The whites built up their cities. Other populations, the African populations, would come in and want to benefit from that. And that's where you got some of the separation, white areas, black areas. But then eventually, because of all kinds of progressive pressures, and we know there's a lot of communist party action going on there and a lot of agitation, to make a long story short, again, in the early 1990s, they gave this up. So we see the same pattern of the white innovation, white building it up. The other populations want to benefit from that. And even, as Mike said, at 8% of the population, they're still taxed the most. So they're giving into the system with the taxes, giving the most of the system with the taxes. They're producing the most food with the farmlands, and yet they're over a barrel in terms of their population now, in terms of the violence against them. Now, I was in Kreuzberg, a district of Berlin, a few years ago, and it's the Turkish district. And this was a red pill moment for me because I didn't know much about Germany at the time. I didn't know much about the situation in Europe at the time. It was a little before the refugee crisis kicked in a full gear. But I remember visiting Kreuzberg in Berlin and seeing the same things I see in American cities with Hispanic populations here. the same kind of interactions, the same kind of, the Germans being guilty, the Turkish people being on government programs, getting the handouts, benefiting from the productivity of the native German population. And I went back home with a lot to think about because, same pattern here, only, it's Turkish people in Germany. Here in the States, it's Hispanic people from Central and South America in the States. And then you start to hear about situations in South Africa. And then you start to hear about, as Mike's explaining, the situation in Australia. The pattern is the same everywhere. And at some point, we have to rally around who we are and what is in our best interest. Sometimes there's a time and a place not to be super universalistic about your morality and say, you know what? I wish other people well, but I have to protect my kind, my family, my civilization, my people in this case. And we have to do what is good for us. In our circles, we're starting to see this question posed more. What is good for the Europeans? Period. That needs to be a rallying cry. That needs to be the focal point of a lot of the ways that we are asking and answering questions around society and politics.